We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Does the Israeli killing spree in Gaza signal a turning point in the struggle of the Palestinian people for national liberation? Will this be remembered as the era of national liberation for a people who were driven from their homes, from their villages, starting 75 years ago and repeatedly since? Have we entered a new stage in the struggle for Palestinian freedom? Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Mohammed Nabulsi. He is an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement and an attorney based in Houston, Texas. Mohammed, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me again.
Mohammed, history is filled with all sorts of ironies. You can't look at Gaza and not come to the conclusion that this appears to be the darkest moment for the people of Palestine, certainly for the people of Gaza. The genocide, the killing of 30,000 plus people, thousands and thousands of children and their moms, the destruction of so many homes. And at the same time, the global outrage against the genocide has become, I believe, a material factor in the overarching movement for Palestinian freedom. The Israeli government and its U.S. sponsor are completely isolated. We have recordings from the so-called Anti-Defamation League, and I'm going to read a little bit of a transcript. These are the pro-Zionist sort of propaganda units inside the United States who believe that the public opinion has turned so decidedly in the United States that it's a huge, what they call a major problem. I'm going to go over some of that transcript. But anyway, I want to get your take first on this. And of course, as you mentioned the last time you were on the show, we are in Ramadan now. So the stakes of a bigger, expanding struggle couldn't be higher.
Yeah, I think within the context of the Palestinian struggle, the Oslo Accords brought in a period of lull, of pacification, of depletion of resistance and resistance forces throughout Palestine and in the region. And that period essentially produced conditions of repression and siege for Palestinians wherever they were. And it's through those conditions, the maximalist strategies that the Israelis pursued, especially the far right, that we see the birth of a new phase in the Palestinian struggle. And October 7th sort of marked the peak of escalation. And since that moment, what we've seen is the contradictions that have emerged as a result of this pursuit of a maximalist expansion by the Israelis, their desire to completely subjugate the Palestinians, has actually engendered new resistance, especially amongst younger generations. And it's not just younger generations in Palestine that have sort of rose up. It's throughout the entire region, right? And we've seen the emergence of a resistance strategy throughout the region from various forces that are aligned on a struggle against imperialism, understanding that the U.S. and the West's broadly domination of the region must come to an end, and it can only come to an end through actual confrontation with their interests and their aspirations in the region. Now, on a global stage, this emergence of resistance by youth, by younger generations, has been paralleled by the younger generations throughout the Palestinian diaspora within the West. And we've seen, especially on the level of Gen Z, millennials, these younger generations, a clarity for them on the stakes of the Palestinian struggle, their role in it, their participation in it, their understanding of the propaganda that's being deployed throughout mainstream media and at the podiums of the White House. This clarity has resulted, in my opinion, in a qualitative shift amongst younger generations, and even those beyond those generations, in an understanding of what the struggle requires of us, a need to build revolutionary consciousness and movement within the West in order to actually confront imperialism, not just wherever it strikes, but also where it starts, where it's launched, which is obviously what we call the belly of the beast. And so this parallel emergence of resistance globally is one that began to be built decades ago. And I think we had various iterations of struggle in Palestine, the Second Intifada, various uprisings that have taken place over the last 6 years. And similarly, in the US, we've seen Occupy Wall Street, the anti-war movement during the Iraq period, the uprisings against police brutality and violence. And so this accumulation of experience, infrastructure, resources, skills, all has culminated in this moment where we're able to actually capitalize on a period that allows for qualitative shift. And so that's where we're at. Now, with Ramadan, the last point that you mentioned, I think we've already started to see sort of the consequences. The Israelis themselves, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that Ramadan is upon us, have essentially delayed their ground invasion of Gaza. Now, they've signaled various excuses for that, but we can get into it a little further, my read of why they haven't yet invaded Rafah. But I think Ramadan brings, first of all, millions upon millions of Muslims into mosques who will be listening to sermons daily on the plight of Palestinians and the need for the Muslim world to mobilize in defense and support of Palestine. It'll also bring heightened attention to the fact that Palestinians are starving in the Gaza Strip. So like there will be a visceral empathy from people fasting that will understand the need to actually bring this genocide to an end. So all of these things, I think, and obviously coupled with the fact that the region can at any moment escalate in confrontation with imperialism and the Israeli state itself, I think brings us into a new period of this genocide, one that I think will ultimately bring it to an end.
Let's talk about this new mass movement. And I'm glad you mentioned and made the point that the Palestinian youth in the diaspora have such clarity and are taking the lead. In the last month, since October 7th, I know in the Shut It Down for Palestine Coalition, I'm in the Answer Coalition, we've organized collectively mass marches in Washington of hundreds of thousands, twice on November 4th and then later on January 13th. People have disrupted traffic on bridges. They've disrupted businesses. Politicians can't go out and talk anywhere without being disrupted, including the President of the United States. College campuses have been aflame with protest, student groups being repressed by administrations, and yet the protests continue. When you look at this whole sort of extreme level of activity in the last 5 months, Palestinian young people have been at the center of it. Palestinian young people have been in the leadership. For those of us who are not Palestinian, we've been working in partnership, in alliance, sort of in united front, in coalition. But all around the country, young Palestinians have been sort of the detonator for these other young people. I mean, in America, in a multinational society, a multi-ethnic society, certain parts of the population at times become the leadership. They become the detonators for others. Certainly in the Black Civil Rights Movement, which became a global or globalized youth movement in the United States, globalized in the sense that it was universal. Young white people, young Latinos, young Asian Americans were there, but it was young Black people who were really the leadership in many ways. They were the detonators. They were the catalysts. And then the rest of the population joined in. But there was this divide between young and old, with certain groups able to, for historical reasons, take the leadership. That's actually what we've witnessed for the past 6 months. That's new in American politics. I mean, there have been Palestine actions in solidarity for a couple decades. They were pretty small at first, got bigger. But this level of activism and leadership from young people in the Palestinian diaspora, that's one of the really remarkable qualities of what's going on.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think like it must be situated in a context of decades of building of organization. And that's what's important here. So this movement, this mobilization of Palestinian youth is not spontaneous, nor is it reactive. It's not something that is coming out of nowhere. In fact, you have organizations that have essentially primed young organizers, Palestinians and non-Palestinians, to think about um, organizing mobilization, movement, direct action in a way that requires strong organization, structure, um, connections to community, networks, things of that nature. And that work has spent, especially since the rise of the student movement, especially the Students for Justice in Palestine, that work took decades to build. And it took a lot of experimenting around politics, around tactics, and that culminated in this moment. And so for PYM, the Palestinian Youth Movement specifically, this is years in the making. And 2021 was sort of our first moment where we entered the scene on a national level across various locations to confront Zionism beyond sort of the spontaneous protest that would take place over the last 10 years. And for PYM since 2021, it's essentially building up the capacity to prepare for this moment. Reflecting on my own life, I first became seriously involved in organizing following the 2014 war in Gaza. And so now we're 10 years from that moment. 2014 resulted in a qualitative shift for my own understanding of the world as a young Palestinian. At the time, I was 20, 21 years old. And I was faced with this brutality, though it lasted a lot shorter than what we're experiencing now, that changed the way I thought about the world. And ever since then, I entered into organization. My politics sharpened, my skill set sharpened, my connections and networks with various groups increased. And so imagine that happening on a mass scale with Palestinian youth wherever they are, Palestinian Arab youth, and not just Palestinian Arab youth, like we said, the youth who surround them also experiencing these shifts. And so 10 years into building this genocide, 10 years of honing myself and honing our organizations produced our capacity to respond to this moment in 2021, or I'm sorry, in 2024. And so now what we're seeing is even on a greater scale, this qualitative shift for new generations, new youth who for the first time are being faced with the mask off of US empire and of Zionist settler colonialism in a way they've never seen before. And now I can anticipate that this movement that was built at various junctures, its foundation, so to speak, built in various junctures, now is building off that foundation and raising the political ceiling for what it means to struggle against imperialism and Zionism.
Real change in society, Mohammed, whether it's reforms, far-reaching reforms, or even reforms that are not far-reaching but important, or other more radical transformations and even revolutions, they happen really as a consequence of multiple factors. But one of the key ingredients is what's going on below, what's going on with the masses of people, what's going on in terms of people's thinking, their consciousness. Some people, I think, misread the social justice movement or the radical movement, however one wants to, call it, and think that our real target is some politician in some office or some corporate executive or the president, where what we know from a historical sort of assessment of how change happens is that change ultimately at any one of those levels, from reform to revolution, happens when the people change. It's when the people become actors, when the people become conscious, when they enter onto the historical stage, and then there is no power greater. You can say power to the people, but there is really the greatest power in the people once the people have started to move. And I think that's what's happening. And as you have described it so accurately, that this is it's not just about Palestine, even though Palestine at the moment is the catalyst. There was Occupy, there was the Black Lives Matter movement, there was the anti-war movement, the anti-globalization movement, all of these, the movement against racism and police violence after the killing of George Floyd, all of these things have been happening, and these movements ebb and flow. But what's most important is, are there organizers? Are there cadres? Are there organizations that have staying power so that even when a movement ebbs, and all mass movements go up and down, when it ebbs, there's some vessel so that there's a collective memory. So it's not all starting from scratch once again. And we see this all over the country. I want to play a couple video clips because as we're talking right now, organizers, Palestinian, young Arab Americans, and non-Arab Americans, non-Palestinians, are shutting down San Francisco airport or parts of it. And then I want to show another clip from yesterday in Cleveland. And then I want to talk about how the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the big political thinkers, so to speak, are trying to describe or characterize this rising tide of youth resistance, which again, I think is fundamentally false. Anyway, let's play this first clip. This is, I think, San Francisco's airport today, Wednesday, as we're speaking. Okay, so that's San Francisco. There are a lot of protests in San Francisco, but there's been this intensifying level of protest almost every day. Let's go to another part of the country. Let's go to Cleveland, Ohio. Not a hotbed of radicalism by any stretch. This is what activists did in Cleveland yesterday. Let's play this clip.
This is Dallas with the PSL. You can see behind me, this is the highway right next to the airport. Directly behind us, that is Cleveland International Airport. You can see that the police have shut down the entrance as we brought our caravan here. We have hundreds and hundreds of vehicles, hundreds of cars that have shut down this highway. Our car caravan has taken over this entire highway from Gaza and from Palestine.
Cleveland, San Francisco. Speaking of the bourgeoisie or the capitalists, I want to mention Nikki Haley, because according to Nikki Haley, Mohammed, the reason there's been all of this change in consciousness is because of TikTok. And TikTok was on the House floor today. Overwhelmingly, they voted that unless the Chinese company, parent company, sells to an American technology company, of course, TikTok will be banned. There's 170 million U.S. users of TikTok, almost all of them young. So here's Nikki Haley, Mohammed. We really do need to ban TikTok once and for all. And let me tell you why. For every 30 minutes that someone watches TikTok every day, they become 17% more anti-Semitic, very precise numbers here, 17% more anti-Semitic, more pro-Hamas based on doing that. So that's Nikki Haley's assessment. The ADL, Anti-Defamation League, there's a leaked tape that's making the rounds online. The head, I think his name is Jason Goldblatt, was talking to other supporters of Israel about the problem that we have. He says, I also want to point out that we have a major generational problem. All the polling I've seen, ADL's polling, ICC's polling, independent polling, suggests this is not a left-right gap, folks. This is the issue of the United States support for Israel is not left and right. It is young and old. And the numbers of young people who think that Hamas's, massacre was justified is shockingly and terrifyingly high. Now, by that, what he means, the mass opposition of young people to the genocide being committed by the Israeli government, the Israeli military against the people of Gaza. This mass uprising is nobody's saying, yeah, we're all for the so-called massacre on October 7th. The point is, all of these people are recognizing that there's a problem, but they're not locating the problem, the problem of young people moving away politically from the right channel. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think they're obviously reacting to the weakening of their hegemony over the narrative, right? Their capacity to be able to manufacture consent for their wars, for their genocides, for their policies. And I think what they don't recognize is that this change amongst youth, the shift didn't start because of TikTok. It started because of the actual mobilization into the streets, right? And that goes back years. So Palestinians, pro-Palestine activists have been building with other struggles and other youth who are working on their own issues, like we said with Black Lives Matter. And it's through these connections that have been built, the development of a shared politics, right? Where we understand each other's struggles in a much better way. That is allowed for youth, for this to actually expand amongst younger generations. And now that's reflected also in their platforms. And you have to understand the actual creators, the content producers on TikTok or social media sites are people themselves, are these youth, right? And so it's not a centralized sort of production that takes place where the Chinese Communist Party or some nefarious force that they want to blame is gathering people together, setting an agenda on what they should propagate, and then actually like directing them to move in that way. That's actually what happens with U.S. mainstream media, right? Like the U.S. mainstream media is a controlled operation. A few corporations tied to the ruling class in a very direct way are the ones who are able to curate and then put forward content. Their problems with TikTok is their inability to do that with this platform, and their inability to control what youth are producing, not just consuming, right? So it's not a problem of consumption here. It's a problem of the fact that young generations are able to actually put forward politics, create knowledge, right? Do their own work to understand the world around them and to connect the dots between what this government thinks and says and what is actually happening. So I think that is where they're failing. I think whether or not this actually passes the Senate after the House voted on it is inconsequential to the sea change that we're seeing, because ultimately those who are involved in organizing, the younger generation that tends progressive, that leans progressive itself, right, is not going to abandon its values because they no longer have a platform. They're going to continue to engage other people their age that are forwarding politics. And they see themselves, young generations, as enlisted in a lifetime of work towards struggle. And that's what's important. And the organizations that exist around the US, around the West more broadly, are now absorbing these youth, are actually placing them in refining and improving their understanding of the world and their understanding of what struggle actually requires of them. And so I'm optimistic that regardless of what this ruling class may try to do, this younger generation, which they won't be able to capture, will find new ways to actually engage in knowledge production and organize themselves for a better world.
And when you think about what's happening to young people in Palestine, Mohammed, and of course this is then generating out to people in the diaspora, the young fighters in the last few months, they're probably in their early 20s. That's, the typical age. Well, those people were just little kids in 2008 when the Israeli massacre in Gaza was so, also began to get indignation and outrage from the world, but not at this level. If you eliminate and kill 15,000 kids or 20,000 kids or 25,000 kids and their moms, you're not going to kill everyone, but those people who live, the siblings, they're going to want to fight. They're going to be a little older, maybe, when they have the capacity to fight sort of arms in hand, but they're not going to disappear. I mean, the only way Israel could actually succeed is to have a complete genocide. It seems to me that the question of Palestine is so imbued with the consciousness of the Palestinian people that this actually is a material factor in the struggle. Usually you associate the struggle for national liberation with the land question. Whose land is it? Is it the colonizers or not? In the case of the Palestinians, when they've been driven from their land to all parts of the world, the consciousness about the homeland hasn't actually shifted. It's gone through stages and phases, but it's not diminished. In fact, the Palestinian people as an entity exist in many ways because of this consciousness of struggle. And so when you kill this many people, this many civilians, this many children and their mothers, that's a recipe not for the end of the Palestinian people, but for greater resistance. That's why the Zionist sort of projection is like a fantasy. I want to talk to you about that, and then I want to come back and ask you what you think about the U.S. orientation towards not just the Israeli war, but Israel itself. But let's start with this other element that it's impossible really for the Zionists to defeat the Palestinian people because of the nature of Palestinian consciousness and resistance.
Yeah. And so I think what people don't really understand about the Palestinian struggle is, given that it's 75 years in the making, if not actually longer, right? We're talking about before that resistance to British colonialism, is the Palestinian national identity emerged and was forged in a phase of resistance, in a context of resistance. And so the central facets, the central tenets to Palestinian identity, both religious in the sense of this is a large Muslim, vast majority Muslim population, even the understanding of Islam and the principles, in the same way that we would think about, for example, the Black church and the role the Black church played during the civil rights movement, right? The articulation of liberation theology. And so that being born out of the conditions of the Black people and their struggle. And so that imbued within it understanding and articulation of even theology that relates to resistance or the need to overcome oppression, right? And so Palestinian culture, Palestinian religious institutions and how they understand, whether it's Christian or Muslim, Palestinian dance, music, art, whatever it might be, reflects an identity that's rooted in a firm understanding of their conditions, right? That this is a struggle over land, this is a struggle for rights of a people, a struggle for self-determination. At the same time, it actually articulates the path needed for us to forge and take in order to achieve actual justice, liberation, and dignity. You hear this in the chants, and I always think about this when I listen to Palestinian music or where I hear the chants that come out of Palestine. The actual sophistication of the politics, the depth of the politics, in something as basic as a song, reflects to me the undying spirit of our struggle. That I can listen to a song that was produced 60 years ago and it still speaks to my conditions today, or that a song can be produced today and reflects experience from 70 years ago. And that this is actually across the diaspora. And in fact, if you look at what the diaspora has brought to the scene in the U.S., right, or in the West, or wherever the diaspora is, are the term liberation, the term dignity, the term martyrs and martyrdom, right? The notion of armed struggle. All of these politics, all of these concepts that are central to anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism are often absent from the domestic struggles of the U.S., right? You don't hear the struggle of, whatever it might be, population as a struggle for dignity or a struggle for national liberation or self-determination, or that the people who are assassinated in the streets of this country are martyrs, for example, at the hands of the state. I think the Palestinian, even that spirit, these concepts that are central to understanding who we are and what we need to do in order to liberate ourselves, are now being introduced to new audiences and being adopted by those audiences. And we're seeing the backlash from the mainstream media early on when the students at I want to say in Virginia, I don't remember exactly the school, it might have been George Washington University, when they broadcast "Glory to Our Martyrs" on a building, on a university building, there was a suspension of the SJP, the students. There was a targeting specific students, right? And there was this fierce backlash by mainstream pundits over the fact that martyrdom and martyr was being used. We saw this also in the conversation around Aaron Bushnell, right? The attempt to effectively sap any meaning of his act without recognizing that actually the people in Palestine who've now named the street after him, the people in Yemen who now carry banners of him wherever they go, have now adopted him as a martyr, as a symbol of our struggle. And so this transnational building of a spirit around anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism is now being actualized, and speaks to the impact of the Palestine movement, the Palestinian struggle, the fact that it can serve as a lens by which we understand our own world, our own realities, and our own struggles. And that is the contribution of the Palestinian struggle to the world. That is the internationalization of Palestinian struggle, but not just the internationalization of Palestinian struggle, the internationalism of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. And it's domesticized. I don't know what the word might be, but the bringing of it to a domestic context, right? Imbuing within it an understanding that the world around you, and the immediate world around you, relates to the struggle of Palestinians.
Indeed, I think those are extremely important points. You know, our show is called The Socialist Program, and from the beginning of socialism, beginning with the utopian socialists or the scientific socialists or the socialists of the Second International or the Third International, during this entire epoch where socialism has become a political movement with different iterations, the idea that it's not simply a national movement, but it is a profoundly international movement has been a cornerstone during all the different stages and phases. It's really just central to socialism. Today, Mohammed, we're not using the same language that would have been used 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. People don't talk about imperialism in the colonized world because many of the colonies have become at least legally independent entities. We don't even use language from the 60s, like the third world versus imperialism, etc. We're using language like global north and global south. And all of these terms, especially when they're associated with a geography, like something's in the west or something's in the north or something's in the east or the south, it can be a little bit misleading, even though generally speaking, everybody gets the main point. The idea that somebody like Aaron Bushnell, an active duty member of the U.S. Air Force, could take his own life at the Israeli embassy in line with the martyrdom of those who are fighting and resisting and those who are just targeted because they're Palestinians and have been targeted by the Israeli military. The fact that he, as a white American service member, could have a street named after him in Palestine or in Yemen, it's an indicator of the profoundly, underlying internationalism of the Palestinian struggle. And when you think about national liberation movements, this has always been a hallmark of the viable national liberation movements that, in spite of all odds, struggled and won. Think about Algeria, the revolution of 1 million martyrs, fighting to be free from France. Or Vietnam, where 2 to 3 million Vietnamese people died, but yet succeeded in defeating U.S. imperialism. Or in South Africa, still an incomplete victory, but nonetheless the end of formal apartheid. All of these movements, all of these national liberation movements, they had the struggle on the battlefield between the colonizers and the oppressed. They had the issue of diplomacy. Did they have friends and allies? Were their friends and allies regional or beyond? Was there a rear base area, like in the case of Vietnam? China and the USSR shared a border with North Vietnam. Then there was the question of the second front, so to speak. In the case of Algeria, it would have been the front inside of France. In the case of Vietnam, the front was here in the United States, although it was everywhere else too. In other words, where the people of the oppressor imperialist country become an active factor in their support for national liberation. And sometimes those movements were not explicitly for the National Liberation Front, say in Vietnam, but they were against the war in some ways. And the NLF, the National Liberation Front, made sure to nurture any and all manifestations of opposition to imperialism from within the imperialist metropole. That these national liberation movements have a second front inside the imperialist countries. In other words, this sort of contemporary manifestation of internationalism is in many ways a hallmark of our struggle. And I think now, in the last months, it's become revived in practice, and now we have to conceptualize it, theorize it, recognize it as a major part of the global struggle. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I think the analogy is very apt. I think in ways it's analogous to both situations, in ways very different than both situations. I think the fact that you have a diaspora population, right, that has been effectively exiled from its homeland has produced the conditions for consciousness raising resistance outside of Palestine, right? And that was necessitated by the fact that Palestinians, a foundational aspect of our struggle is the right of return. That's one. Then what we have is also a multi-generational struggle. So you have generations of Palestinians that are being born in diaspora that have now been forced to both understand their local context, meaning how do I bring Palestine here? And also have departed from some of the concerns and the fears of the prior generations around deportation, around being denied citizenship, things of that nature. So that's on the one hand. Even though we're thousands of miles away, effectively, as Palestinians in the US or in the West more broadly, unlike France, where it is also a diaspora, there was a diaspora dynamic to it. There were Algerians inside of the metropole that were struggling alongside the left, the French left, in different ways to end the settler colonial enterprise inside of Algeria. And Vietnam, I think the difference being is the conscription that took place facilitated the radicalization of American youth. And in conjunction with global anti-colonial struggle, global and left struggle inside of this country, the civil rights movement, et cetera, right? And I think the similarity here is the role of the US, the understanding of the role of the US. Whereas the US was the primary actor in Vietnam, the US, in my opinion, is still a principled act, is still a primary actor in what's happening inside of Palestine. And so it's, in a way, drawing on some of the various elements. I think where we'll struggle, what differentiates us between us and Vietnam and the way that the Vietnam anti-war movement was so critical is the implication for people on a personal level beyond Palestinians and Arabs, right? Where conscription facilitated that, we don't have that here. But I think and that's what you're speaking to your point, that's what requires us to theorize and understand, well, how do we actually sharpen these contradictions for the broader American public? I think younger generations are seeing imperialism, its consequences for their own lives, their ability to afford a home, to actually purchase a home, which is understood to be a staple of the American dream, the amount of debt they're straddled with for pursuing an education, healthcare costs, etc. I think what we require is a unified theory that actually ropes all of these things together, understands the violence in Palestine as integral to U.S. imperialist policy, as integral to the way that capitalism in the U.S. functions, and its consequences for the working class, for younger generations, etc. And so I think the Palestine movement is a really important opportunity for us to understand the international, local dynamic and to articulate what actually ropes those things together. What is the global system that conditions not just the lives of Palestinians, but the lives of ordinary Americans around us? It's the same system. Its consequences look different depending on where you are positioned within that global system.
Yeah, let's turn now to U.S. imperialism and its strategic and tactical orientation at the moment. You and I and other members of the Palestinian Youth Movement have assessed this struggle over the many months, but let's talk about right now. March 10th, the beginning of Ramadan, was also the deadline for what Netanyahu said and the Israeli military said would be the invasion, full-scale invasion of Rafah. So we're a couple days past that now. The Biden administration is airlifting, in some level, airdropping material aid to the people of Gaza, even as It continues sending munitions to Israel so that Israel can drop American bombs and use American bullets to kill Palestinians. I mean, that's a profound contradiction, but humanitarian aid is often viewed and must be viewed in a war from a strategic point of view, because humanitarian aid is not simply people starting to become friendly to or think about humans. There's some strategic element within humanitarian aid always in the context of war. So I want to get your opinion as to what the U.S. is actually doing. The U.S., the Biden administration is also talking about sending or creating a sort of a portable pier close to Gaza for the eventual delivery of supplies to people in Gaza, meaning in some ways the U.S. is saying we're going to interfere with the complete and absolute siege that Israel has put on the people of Gaza. Anyway, where is the U.S. at? Where's the Biden administration at? What's your take on what's going on right now?
Well, we've seen two things come out of the administration more recently. We have this intelligence report that was released in the last couple of days that articulated two important positions. First, and this report is based on data collected since mid-January, and so it doesn't account for the last month and a half or 2 months nearly of fighting and developments on the ground. The report basically stated that the Israelis are not going to be able to achieve their military objectives, that they believe that the Palestinian resistance will remain intact in a fighting force and capable of actually resisting Israeli colonization of Palestine for years to come. That was articulated. The second, they discussed the weakening, and this is a surprising thing for them to actually release in an intelligence report about threats, and national security threats. They articulated that the Israeli government itself is on the verge of collapse effectively, that the ruling coalition as it exists is unsustainable, and that they see the potential emergence of a alternative, a moderate politician, an alternative to Netanyahu and his coalition. And so these 2 points, released in the moment that they are, indicate to me that the assessment by the Americans, and I think there's no reason to doubt this because we can also see what the Palestinian resistance is capable of doing even up until this moment, is that the Israelis have no prospect of actual complete military victory, right? And by that, I mean the complete destruction of Hamas, its destruction of its capabilities, both its productive capacities, its ability to produce weaponry, and its tunnel system, its ability to actually accumulate resources, weaponry, and protect its people and protect its soldiers and leadership. And so we've seen that. We've also, if you track this alongside what the Israelis are doing with Rafah, right? They've been signaling that they're going to invade. And in fact, today, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister for the Israelis, essentially issued a statement saying, for those of you who think we have been stalling around Rafah, you'll see what we're about to do, effectively signaling they're about to invade Rafah. Now, what's missed and what's lost on this is an actual assessment of the Israelis' military's, both its equipment, where it's at, and why it's been stalling. On the one hand, there's this talk around the possibility of a ceasefire, but they've been planning, and if they really wanted to create the pressure in order for them to achieve better positioning within the ceasefire, they would have invaded Rafah. The reason is they're in a very weak position. A huge quantity of their tanks have been destroyed. We know that because the fact that they're having to rely more and more on Merkava 3s as opposed to Merkava 4s, which are the more fortified tanks that they have in possession. We see this in the amount of brigades that are being removed from the actual Gaza Strip, and the fact that reservists are now being asked to come back into the Israeli economy. And so they're effectively having to prepare because they're not in a position to invade Rafah. Coupled with the diplomatic pressure that they're experiencing globally, the pressure from now including Gulf states around Ramadan, what I believe is now what we're seeing is we're reaching a peak of contradiction between the U.S.'s assessment militarily. Their desire for them to enter into a ceasefire and to prevent the Israelis from going to Rafah is a military assessment. It's not out of the goodness of their hearts that they see Palestinians suffering. They think the Israelis are positioning themselves for even further strategic defeat or further strategic weakening. And that is not in the interest of the U.S. for the Israelis to be weaker strategically in the region, right? For them to go into Rafah and not achieve anything and come out of it with a worse humanitarian disaster that the U.S. will be seen as responsible for and has isolated them on the global stage, coupled with the fact that the Israelis are not caving to their starvation policy. The most effective tools the Israelis have used over the last 5 months to try to attack the resistance, it's the targeting of civilian infrastructure and the civilian population and the starvation policy. Those are it. And those have reached diminishing returns. That has brought the U.S. into a position it doesn't want to be in diplomatically and has weakened it globally. And so I think that's what's animating the difference. That's why there's now in this intelligence report against the Netanyahu government in a way to try to scapegoat Netanyahu as opposed to the reality that this is a shared strategy across the Israeli political scene. And so I think what we'll see in the next few months is likely an invasion of Rafah, or in the next few weeks at least, likely an invasion of Rafah if we're not able to reach a ceasefire deal. There's claims that, I'll wait for us to get into the actual positions of the resistance and negotiations if we're able to talk about that. But for me, what I see is the invasion of Rafah will happen, and the U.S. has signaled it won't veto a ceasefire resolution if it comes through the actual UN if they invade, because they don't agree with a plan for invasion, because I think they see any sort of military objective achieved with Israeli invasion of Rafah.
Mohammed, let me ask you about that. The Biden administration has a number of concerns. One is its own reelection. You could see from the not committed vote in Michigan, in Minnesota, and other places. In Hawaii, it's like 32%, where there wasn't even a campaign against for vote non-committed. A pretty sizable challenge for Biden at a moment when he's already losing to Trump in all the polls. So there's that sort of narrow Biden interest. But then there's the bigger interest of U.S. imperialism and how it succeeds or doesn't succeed in this very important region of the world. Then you have the U.S. would like to perhaps have a different government in Israel, not led by Netanyahu, but they're not doing anything on the surface that seems decisive to make that happen. And then you have, what you're saying, the move towards an invasion of Rafah, still very much on the table. Last week in our show, we went over what Hamas wants for a ceasefire. Hamas wants the ceasefire. It's the United States that vetoed the ceasefire 3 times, as you mentioned, at the UN. It's the Israeli government that doesn't want it. But it's a ceasefire with certain circumstances, certain conditions. One, a permanent ceasefire, an end to the siege, the removal of Israeli military forces from Gaza. What's your view right now of the negotiating position of Hamas, and also what does it say about the situation on the battlefield? You're basically suggesting or telling us that whatever the Israelis say about they've killed this leader or that leader from Hamas, they haven't basically succeeded at all in terms of the announced military objective of destroying Hamas. Anyway, let's talk about how the resistance sees the next days and weeks and what their demands are.
Yeah, I think the position of the resistance hasn't changed for weeks, and that speaks to their read of their own military capacity, right? Their ability to resist the continued onslaught and the continued attempts to destroy the resistance militarily. There was recently a leaked report from the War Cabinet, the Israeli War Cabinet. This is just a couple of days ago by an Israeli reporter. His name is Barak Ravid, where he discusses how the Israelis want to wait a few more days to see if Hamas will respond to their latest framework around the deals, and that they are considering expanding the mandate of the negotiators should Hamas not respond. Now, they've articulated that the ball is in Hamas's court. Hamas has not shifted its position. There was a report today, I believe, that I saw that they've responded or began to alter the framework that the U.S. put forward through the Paris conference, the Paris meetings. But ultimately, it seems like they're sticking to their position. And I think this reflects their read of both their leverage, their capacity to actually continue to weaken the Israeli position globally and diplomatically, the role that Ramadan will play in that, and the fact that the Israelis have no way further to leverage pressure on the resistance beyond continuing to starve the Palestinian population, which is having its consequences, which is why the resistance is in talks for a ceasefire, but it's not reached a point to where they are forced to capitulate on any of the major terms, which are important because the major terms are a temporary cessation of genocide. So they're not going to capitulate to that. They're not going to return to in 6 weeks to the continued genocide and starvation of their people. There's no interest in doing that. Now, there has been, I additionally saw reports in the last few days of the Qataris putting even further pressure on the resistance in the Arab states by threatening to deport Palestinian leadership, Hamas's leadership in Qatar, and threatening that they would freeze their assets, like Arab states would freeze Hamas's assets. But that doesn't have any actual impact on the military position of Hamas, right? That you deport members of the political bureau located in Qatar that you need to negotiate with in order to bring this genocide to an end makes no sense and doesn't actually constitute real pressure. And so they've noted these two things. If you can imagine, in the middle of a war, a genocide, the two things that they want to use as ultimate leverage that the Israelis are optimistic about that would potentially change Hamas's position is deportation of leaders not on the battlefield and freezing money. That's not going to change anything. And that signals the weakness of the Israelis. If that's the only leverage that you would call for to be placed on Hamas, then that means you really have no path forward to bring Hamas to a position of capitulation.
I want to ask you one final question. The Biden administration since October 7th has sent about 25,000 missiles and bombs to Israel, maybe more, probably more, 55,000 or more artillery shells. So they've given the Israelis a lot to use to kill Palestinians in Gaza. Now they're airdropping humanitarian aid, a very limited amount compared to the need in Gaza to prevent starvation. They're setting up this pier, they say, to bring to a maritime capacity to bring in supplies. Is what the U.S. is doing on that front, does it have an impact on the ground in Gaza? Does it have an impact on the resistance?
Not at all. I think the aid, they provided 11,000 meals to a population of 2.3 million. Hundreds of thousands are on the brink of death from starvation, are experiencing a famine. And they've in fact killed a few Palestinians as part of this airdrop because the parachutes did not launch. And so people essentially were crushed under the aid that was meant to sustain them. And so that's been a total disaster. I don't believe this pier has anything to do with humanitarian aid. First, they're talking about its building it's going to require 3 to 6 months. And so in what way does that solve this immediate need for aid? And the Americans know that if they were to actually place pressures on the Israeli to bring in aid, they could. It's unbelievable to me that this superpower has its hands tied about whether or not trucks are allowed in to the Gaza Strip. This is, for me, theater put on for American audiences, Biden voters, in order to make them appear that they're placing any pressure. But at the end of the day, I believe in the grand scheme of things, the Americans and the Israelis are fully aligned on the prosecution of this war. It's just on some of the minutia that they disagree, on some of the details where they would like to see the situation politically in the aftermath and what is required in the immediate in order to position yourself for that aftermath. That's where there's difference. But beyond that, there isn't. This peer is likely security related, right? It's the ability of the in the post situation, in the post-war situation, to be able to manage and attack the resistance that's going to remain in the Gaza Strip. It has nothing to do with humanitarian aid. And I think, especially if you see it in relationship to the corridors that the Israelis have created, where they've essentially flattened land in order for them to divide up the Gaza Strip in the long term, to be able to occupy it permanently, whether through international force or through their own ground troops or whatever, or through the Palestinian Authority, whatever it might be. They're creating a regime of control, and this peer is part of that process. That's all it is. And I think we need to be much more clear in the way that we articulate the role of the U.S. The U.S. is not in a limited sense or hand-holding or giving suggestions or opinions. They're managing this war. And they're managing it not just in the immediate, but in the long term. And they're managing it in a way that is independent of who runs the Zionist government. They're managing it for their own strategy and vision for what they want to happen in Palestine.
Right. So Joe Biden, really, truly a partner in genocide. If Donald Trump were to be elected, Mohammed, given the strategic nature of the Israeli relationship with U.S. imperialism, that won't alter, I don't think. I think that this is a relationship whereby the United States, the imperial power, views Israel, in spite of whatever differences it has with some of the narrower interests of the Zionists of whatever stripe, they see Israel as an extension of American power. And if the Palestinians win, it will inspire resistance from oppressed Arab and other peoples of the Middle East against the U.S. empire. So they view it really from the vantage point of empire and from the vantage point of classical imperialist sort of interests against the colonized people when they fight to try to liberate themselves. The U.S. could have said at the end Bien Phu, since we talked about Vietnam, okay, Vietnam doesn't want to have a French colonial overlord. The bitter fruits of French colonialism in Vietnam were so detestable that Vietnam had to be free from them. But instead of welcoming Vietnamese independence and even trying to co-opt it, U.S. imperialism took the military mantle from French imperialism and launched what we call the Vietnam War, a war that lasted the next 15 years. Anyway, it's the global struggle between the oppressed people of what we now call the global South, the colonized and semi-colonized parts of the world, and imperialism. And it's a fight that won't stop. But Mohammed, giving you the last word, we're in an era where at one time it was Vietnam, at one time it may have been Algeria, at one time it was South Africa. Right now, the center of that global struggle is Palestine. Go ahead, you have the last word.
Absolutely, absolutely, it's Palestine. And I think, I hope this heightened moment of struggle for the Palestinians and the Arab world more broadly could bring clarity to the rest of the world on the necessity to move beyond U.S. hegemony globally and the need to restructure the system, and not just restructure it, but confront it essentially, on the one hand, militarily, but also politically, discursively, to alter the understanding of the people in our locales, in our communities, of the role of empire and who benefits from it and who ultimately suffers from it. It is the American working class that is sent to die in these wars. It is the American working class that is being robbed. It's the taxes that are being used to essentially prop up this military-industrial complex that has expanded its reach all over the world is at the expense of the American people, at the expense of public infrastructure, public education, healthcare. Everything and anything that we're seeing is done in order to preserve empire at the expense of the people. And that confrontation must be heightened, and it must be done in a way that enlists all of the different currents, the progressive currents of this country and of the globe, into one shared, united front in confrontation with empire.
All right, and for those watching this show or listening to it, Mohammed is with the Palestinian Youth Movement. That's PalestinianYouthMovement.com, Mohammed, if I'm right about that, if people want to look at the Palestinian Youth Movement website. Mohammed, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.